let's dive right in. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. My name is Frank Sullivan. I'm going to be your host and guide today as we do a little bit of a deep dive into cloud security and governance. To get us started, and just to prove to me that you can all use the chat box, does anyone know where this particular castle actually is? On the chat box, you'll see a little blue box that says chat to hosts and panelists, or chat to everyone. Make sure that you click everyone. Does everyone actually know where this castle is? We often play this little game. We've had Buckingham Palace, we've had Hogwarts, we've had all sorts of wrong answers. A lot of people are saying it's Edinburgh Castle. Are you sure? It is indeed Edinburgh Castle. All right. Well, thank you, George. Leah, Nicole, you are bang on the money. You are absolutely correct. I have got a wonderful panel today. Really, really experienced. I've got Gary Penolver, CTO from Quod Orbis. I've got Stephen Quigg, aka Squigg, Senior Principal Security at AWS. I've got Joe Pindar, co-founder of Fresh Security, and I have Neil Campbell, one of our principal architects at Cloudsoft. It is my great pleasure to welcome you guys today. Gary, do you want to give us a quick 20 seconds on your background?
Yeah, sure. As you say, I'm the CTO with Quod Orbis. We've got a continuous controls monitoring platform which we launched a few years ago. We help sort of organizations get some assurance around their controls, whatever shape they might take, cloud or on-prem, etc. And probably more interestingly, we were acquired last month, so it's been a busy few months.
It has been a very busy few months. Squigg, pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I'm Squigg. Been at AWS for 11 years. I lead security for our financial services business now. My job is to prepare AWS and the industry for the days when the majority of the world's financial systems hopefully run on our cloud platform, but helping build a resilient and secure future for everyone.
Thank you very much. Joe, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Joe Pindar, 20 plus years in cybersecurity, starting at the national level and more recently working with small, mid-sized businesses to bring security processes up to standard. We work mainly with startups and private equity-backed organizations that are trying to raise their security standards up to the expected levels that they find within those environments.
You also just happen to be the one on the panel who has the coolest way of dialing into this webinar.
Indeed, via satellite.
And Neil, always a pleasure to have you, my friend. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. So as Frank says, I'm one of the principal cloud architects with Cloudsoft. So security has been part of my working life for over 25 years through roles in pen testing, security architecture, solution architecture, and consultancy. So security is part of who I am. These days with Cloudsoft, I help customers, whether they are small to medium businesses or enterprises, to migrate to and operate in the cloud, including doing that securely.
Well, now that you've had a chance to get to know us a little bit, I'm Cloudsoft's CMO and ringleader-in-chief for these events. It would be really nice for us to get a chance just to get to know you a little bit. Using the chat box, will you tell us where you've dialed in from today, just so we can get a sense of the geographic spread? A lot of you recognize the Edinburgh Castle, so I'll assume we've got some locals. Italy, Valencia, very nice. Ray from Windsor. Ray Jackson, definitely a friend of Cloudsoft. You're very welcome. Squigg wants to go to Valencia as well. Yes, it's quite different from where you are, Squigg. Kinross, York, South Coast, UK. Steve Goodman is following obscurity principles here, somewhere generally on the south coast of the UK, not an exact city match. That's good. That's very clever. Barcelona. Very good. Okay, that's quite a good geographic spread. So we know where you're dialing in from. I'm going to share a little poll with you, which should take no more than 127 seconds. That's the record I have from the previous webinar. All right. So tell me if you can see this. Little poll should have popped up. Just 3 simple questions. So we want to make sure that we're hitting the right notes here. So do you own security? Is security a big thing for you? Yes. Yes, a bit. No, not at all. Some of the key challenges you're having, are they very human? Getting humans to do what you need them to do? Is it keeping up with new threats? Wondering script kiddies and AI? Is it all of the above? And then we've got some pretty good AWS security review and workshops if you're interested. No pressure. Panelists, can you see the information coming through just as I can? It's kind of interesting. A third, ha 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 ha. Maybe I've not enabled the admin controls. I will make you all co-hosts. What I can see right now, a third are working on, yes, they own security completely. 20%, they own a lot of security. 27%, a bit of security. And 27%, no, don't own security at all, don't really touch it. Key challenges, more than half of people are struggling with securing the process as opposed to the product. 3/4 are worried about keeping up with new threats in AI. 50% getting humans to follow protocol. 13% mysteriously other, which is ill-defined, and therefore I can't talk about it. Good. All right, I'm going to share the results on screen, just so you know your peers. I want to make this an interactive session. It's really important that we're able to learn from our peers. I can tell you, without violating GDPR, that we've got some CTOs in the audience. I already recognize you, some CISOs, but we also have some colleagues from across the aisle, SRE, Site Reliability Engineering. We've got some platform ops folks, and we've got some engineering leads and some DevOps folks as well. So this is definitely a technical practitioner audience and also technology leadership audience. So without further ado, thank you very much for sharing that with me. That's really useful for us to get the tone right. I want to make it interactive. Use the chat box. I'll be going through the chat box. I've got it on my left-hand side, and I've got my wonderful panelists on the right-hand side as we progress through. We're going to do this in 3 parts. The first one is what to think about, getting into what does a security culture mean. Part 2, some of the key challenges that our expert panels think are already here coming down the pipe or haven't changed in 20 years. And then part 3, we'll get into some of the practical bits. And of course, there's a Q&A. So if you have anything that you want to ask as we go along, pop it in the chat box and roll the dice. Let's see if I surface it. So part number 1, building a good security culture. Squigg, let me start off by asking you, what do you think is a security culture?
A security culture starts at the top. It's when leaders commit to security being their priority so that people can't go and complain that security is in their way and get a free ticket. When that happens, their leaders should say, we all agree that security is the most important thing that we do, so you can't ignore it. That's for me. That's where it starts.
Interesting. Neil, do you think shipping features versus being secure has always been the balancing act for a lot of technical leaders?
It's always been a big challenge to kind of balance that up. I think the difficulty is not understanding how not doing security properly actually impacts those features. I mean, effectively, nobody wants to use a product that has lots and lots of features, but has suddenly discovered that there is no underlying security, it's breached all the time, it's not resilient, it's not stable, it's not available. People will migrate away from that product quite quickly. So it's always a balancing act internally for the organization, but it's not always well understood how critical security is to creating a good product.
And Joe, what does not a security culture look like, right? Squigg has given us a pretty good, definition of what a security culture is and how it's perceived, top down. What does not a security culture look like?
Sure. So I guess the anti-pattern of a security culture would be ideas written down in dusty binders, so that from an insurance perspective, you can say, we have all of these policies, but they're not ultimately implemented within the business. And then people on the coalface, the people who are actually doing work to move a product forward, to move a service forward, having to make decisions on the best information on that particular day that they might have thought up at that time. And so it's this disconnect between good intentions of doing work with what ultimately is written down somewhere that no one's actually looked at.
So, playing devil's advocate here, I'm actually going to throw this one over to Gary. You're saying there's a lot of road, there's a lot of rubber, Joe, and never the twain shall meet. Gary, does that sound more like an operating model problem than a cultural problem, or do you think the two are intrinsically linked?
Probably a bit of both, isn't it? I think, like you said, I think they're intrinsically linked. I think obviously lots of organisations are on different stages of their journey in terms of some of these things that we're just sort of talking about here, right? You know, there's companies that are born in the cloud where a lot of these kind of things are much easier to kind of instill with a sort of a greenfield organisation. But you know, for a big enterprise that's got a lot of legacy, that's got a lot of history, that's quite difficult. Yeah, and there's some hearts and minds you've got to change to kind of get there, I think. So, and that comes back to the culture and the operating model piece, I think.
All right, top recommendation round robin, starting with Neil. What's the top thing that our audience should think about when it comes to building a security culture? Top thing, 30 seconds.
So think about securing the process, not the product. Make sure you're engaged with the people that actually do those security implementations on a day-to-day basis, the people that are creating infrastructure as code. Make sure that you've engaged with them and you're securing what they do, not what comes out at the other end, because what comes out at the other end changes very, very frequently in our modern world.
Joe?
So I would focus on what does culture actually mean, because we use it as a buzzword. But my working definition of culture is the norms and the rules, the kind of security policies in that dusty folder that we have, the behaviors that people do on a day-to-day basis. But then there's this third element, which we often miss, which is the stories we tell ourselves about how we work and how we operate. If you think about a family gathering, one of the first things that you do to rebuild the culture of the family is to tell stories. Do you remember when? ... And we need to apply that into the security context. And that means at Fresh Security, we use MFA using Yubico keys. At Fresh Security, we follow this design pattern and just reinforcing on a regular basis. This is the way that we work. This is how we think about security in this organization. And ultimately, that's what delivers the culture.
I'm really going to pick up on that point. Nothing quite like stories drives home the importance of a security culture or a security first culture. I think, I remember a time when, or once upon a time when, or do you remember ... when we left that port open and some leaked 300 million customer records into do you remember that time? Good old times. I think it's very important to be aware. That's a hypothetical example in case anyone's worried, but it's a very, very important to remember the bad times to stay attached to the good times.
And to the point made previously about long-serving staff, they actually have all of these stories, and so they can actually be repurposed to explain why we do things in a certain way to new joiners, new members of staff. And it's absolutely critical when a new member of staff comes into a team, comes into a business, that they start to hear these stories, because then they will start to understand why they do what they do, and it's not some abstract set of instructions on an SOP.
I think to your earlier point around, what gets written down versus what actually gets done, or how that knowledge is transferred, I think the ritualization of certain behaviors, now I'm not going to comment on whether it was good or bad, but when I was at Rackspace, we had this thing where it was actually culturally acceptable to send a love letter to the MD or the CEO. It was actively encouraged. If you left your computer unlocked, a colleague saw it as their cultural duty to send a very embarrassing love letter from your email address to the CEO. Guess what? Nobody left their computers unlocked anymore. It happened a few times, but it was the ritualization of something that positively or negativistically changed behavior. Gary, what do you think people can do to move towards a security culture? Top recommendation.
I think it's about getting people to focus on the right things. So not trying to fix everything, but focus on the right things, right? I mean, you've only got to look at the amount of kind of breaches out there that are through not doing the basics properly. Lack of MFA in the case of the Snowflake breach more recently, right? And again, even with the United Health breach in the US, again, it was a lack of MFA again. That focus on doing doing the basics properly, I think is quite important, because if you're trying to do everything, you're not going to do any of it very well. So I think it's kind of honing in and focusing on those, and obviously getting assurance that those things are in place. Like all too often we put things in place and then we forget about them. So making sure that they're continually, that they really are in place, I think is so essential.
Yeah, security isn't an add-on or a do it once. Squigg, top recommendation for security culture.
Collect the data and measure it, which goes to both of my colleagues' points there, very much. There's your assurance. Be driven on data, not your gut's really good. And when your gut tells you something's wrong, keep digging until you find the data that proves it, rather than saying, well, everything looks fine. That would be my one thing. We live in a world now where we're automating as much as we can, which means we get to measure it. We should be able to measure that we are 100% patched, that we're 100% covered, and we should treat not being 100% as a security incident that we need to examine and get to the root cause of to keep driving that data up. So that would be my thing. Find the data and stay focused on the data telling you that things are okay, and act on a very frequent basis, weekly. People have monthly review meetings. What use is a month? By the end of a month, you're 2 months out. Do things on a weekly basis. Treat it as operations. Collect that data. Look at that data, and make sure your data stays good. That'd be my one thing, I think. People just don't, because people simply have very little data to, support statements like, well, everything's fine. Show me.
Show me, tell me. Very good. The foundations for good security. I mean, we're kind of skipping the relationship between good governance and a secure state. I would hold that to be a self-evident point. Let's talk about the foundations for good security. Neil, a lot of things are interconnected and automated. Do you think that makes a cascade more likely? Do you think that the snowball moves so much faster because so many things are interconnected and automated? I just think the scale of system failures are getting bigger and bigger these days.
To a certain extent, but it's always been a problem that we've had as an industry. We possibly lack the tooling to have the visibility of it that we have now. I mean, what's really important is that there are so many things to look at, and most businesses can't necessarily look at everything all at the same time. There's got to be a way to prioritize what you actually look at. Your threat landscape is the critical part of that. You have to kind of look at what you're trying to do through the lens of that threat landscape. What is it that you're exposing? What kind of data do you have? What are the most important things to fix first? As Squigg says, that having that data there is absolutely critical to allow you to see that and prioritize what you need to fix, because there is always a balance.
Joe, foundations for good security. I mean, I think we've all really drove home the point that making things visible, observable, getting a security culture in place, making sure that the operating model and the culture are aligned so that the road does meet rubber. What do you think? 30 seconds, please. What is the number one foundation for good security in the cloud?
I would say consistency.
Okay.
The gap that I'm seeing is that we have well-intentioned use of MFA and the like, but if it's covering 99 accounts out of 100, one of the things that we've learned from security over the last 20, 30 years is that off by one, that one exception is the thing that will ultimately prove the weakness and go forward. And a whole host of incident response situations that I've worked with have been that one account from that one employee that was particularly difficult at this one meeting has led to this gap in the security foundation. And particularly when we look at AI and so on and so forth, yes, there are going to be new threats, but it's going to be mainly around accelerating the speed and the coverage of all the possible combinations of well-known existing threats. That's one of the things we just have to mitigate by making sure we are consistent across the board.
We could dive into that for the next day. That's a really insightful answer. So visibility from Neil, consistency from Joe. Gary, top recommendation. What is the foundation for good security in the cloud from your perspective?
I think it's the same as what I just said, really. It's doing the basics properly, right? Which again is wrapped up with what Joe just said around coverage of making sure you've got your controls applied consistently everywhere and then getting the assurance of it. But I guess just so that I say something different to everyone else, probably architecting, right? Architecting for failure, I think probably, in the sense of making your architecture in the cloud so resilient that it doesn't matter if components fail or if there are issues, that you can rebuild, that kind of idea of immutability, of infrastructure as code, all these kind of concepts, just designing for that from the get-go. Whereas, as I said before, so depending on where the organization is on its journey, a lot of big enterprise lift and shift into the cloud, right, where they don't leverage a lot of those kind of concepts, which I think is rather than taking the time to do it properly, which I think is a failure, personally.
Thank you, Gary. Round us off. Foundations for good security. What does that mean in the world of
Security
cloud?
should be really simple. It should be easier to do the secure thing than not to do the secure thing. So it should be baked into things. Our developers should have the tools to make it easy. Again, building on the other answers here. Policy should be simple. And it should be driven by the threats. If you can do those things, then if you make security simple and easy for people, they will do it. If you make it hard and complex for people, they will not do it. That is the human condition. It's back to this. If our leaders are aligned to say, we will do the right thing, and then we will create an environment that makes it easy to do the right thing, we're winning.
So let me turn this over to the panel for 30 seconds. You've heard visibility from Neil, consistency from Joe, architecting well and following the basics reinforced by Gary, and keeping things simpler. Security needs to be simpler, or else people won't do it. Not one of my extreme experts here on the panel has said a good foundation for security is thinking about what happens the day after. How do we recover from it? So let me ask the audience here in the chat box, to what extent do you see security as preventative, secure the perimeter, put the foundations for in, versus assuming that a breach is going to happen and not keeping all of your eggs in one basket, but really thinking about the day after, thinking about disaster recovery, thinking about recovering from an attack or a breach?
I'm happy to speak to that. So if you've got your foundations in place, it is absolutely critical to test. So you've got to test for what you think is going to happen, because we all make assumptions and potentially make incorrect assumptions. So you have to test, and you're testing everything. You're testing whether you've got the right threats. You're testing whether you've got the right visibility. You've tested whether it's simple enough, because if the test fails and the root cause is someone didn't understand the security policy, that becomes the wrapper for everything you're doing as a foundation.
So I'm going to pick on Ray Jackson because I know he's dialed in. Ray, what do you see security as preventative or not? Something that also encompasses how do we recover? Nicole Christie has got a good point here. What are the most common threats for web-based apps that security specialists are seeing lately? We're going to come on to that, actually. So whilst we reflect on the sort of proactive versus reactive perception of what security is, let's move into part two, because this is where a lot of this is going to sit, right? So, Joe, let me start with you. What top challenges do you see And then kind of, if you can specifically reference what Nicole is asking here in the chat box, really common threats for web-based apps. Is there something that you've seeing occur more recently, or some novel threats that we didn't really see last year? Let me start with you, please. Top challenges.
So I think the top challenge that I see is well-intentioned people remaking the same decisions time and time again. And rather than look at security in the round, have a nice, calm conversation about it in a way that you can really understand and get to the bottom of how you should be architecting something or how you should be implementing something. What I see is that people are pushed against a deadline, are trying to do something to just get it over the line, and they need to make a decision at that point. That decision is not going to be as good as if you had more time, more space to actually make it. And if we can get away from this idea of security decisions are part of a day job to security decisions are in a part of a design approach, as part of a standard set of ways that we work, then it's just a case of standing on the shoulders of giants and pulling those design patterns off the shelf and just implementing them in this new and unique situation. And you're pushing yourself forwards from that. In terms of common threats for applications, I may not be the best person to ask, but what I see consistently is people not managing those patching cycles. When things get released, there is a patch in place, but then the slightest bit of complexity about dependencies and so on and so forth adds friction to the fact that you just need to apply an update to a library to then get it deployed out into production. And so that friction leads to people delaying it or pausing it or putting it off. And it's an issue that we've seen in all the different security environments, but ultimately it's just one more instance of it.
Neil, what are the top challenges that you're seeing in the market?
Sad to say, one of our top challenges is manual operations. There's
Okay.
still an awful lot of activity where people are implementing manually. It is more difficult to understand what's been done. It's certainly more difficult to replicate. Even when you look at trying to recover from disaster, it's much more difficult to rebuild something manually. That's a challenge we see a lot. In terms of the kind of new application threats, sadly, we're still seeing the OWASP top 10, and we're not really making it that much more difficult for people to attack web applications than we have done for a very long time. So it's still a case of not necessarily getting the basics right. We are potentially seeing more threats coming because it's easier to attack things at volume in the cloud, because we could use cloud operations to attack lots and lots of open things, but we're still seeing the same faults happening. So getting the basics right in web application security is still key.
Ray's made a really interesting point here, that the commissioning and implementation of security controls is contextualized by the operation of the business. So, Neil, follow-up question, Mr. Campbell. How important is it that the business operations, the context around which security is implemented, how important is it for the business, I hate that term, but we've got to use it, for the business to be responsive in saying, look, these are things changing in our operations, or these are things changing in our landscape, and actually making their security colleagues aware of it? How important do you think that context is for, new documentation, new process, new protocols?
It is massive. A lot of what we do is built off the understanding of assets. What do we have? What exists? We've all heard stories about shadow IT and people spinning up entire critical functions of businesses in cloud, and their colleagues are unaware these things even exist. There's a lot of challenges to that. Understanding that is critical. What is your change control process for things? Again, about getting the basics right. What is the change control process for things? How do you know that someone is proposing to make a change? What are the security implications to that change? Do you have the right policies and guidance and coaching in place to, as Squigg says, to make it easy to do the right thing?
Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, we're at 3:30, which is the halfway point. Just a simple yes or no in the chat box, please. Are we hitting the right notes? Would you like it to be a little bit more interactive? Do you have any questions? Just a yes or no. Yes, we're hitting the right notes and the right pace for you, or no, we need to change tack a little bit.
While people are doing that, I'd like to answer the question about what are the common web application threats at the moment. The web application firewall was designed exactly for people like you in that situation who may not have full depth experience to threat model web apps and design this into your code. In an ideal world, no one would need web application firewalls because your code would be robust and secure. But for example, the AWS web application firewall has managed rules that we run on your behalf, that if you can put something like that, there are other web application firewalls in front of your web app, you're removing 99.99% of the badness. They don't stop everything, but when you're in that situation where you're just not sure, they're really effective ways of getting most of the dregs of the internet away from you. You still have to worry about people who are targeting you, but those people are fewer and further between than just the random things that, you know, everyone has to face on the internet these days. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add super quick to that, if that's right, Frank.
Yeah, go for it. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's things like identity, like the MFA piece that we mentioned before, right? You know, like it's flaws in business logic, I think, is probably where you see the biggest threats, surely, in web applications these days. It's, you know, if you get some pen testers red team in to try and red team your application, that is usually where they're going to find the most faults, is in the flaws in the business logic itself, in terms of this user should not see this data, etc. It's in those kind of things, and it's the MFA piece, like we said with the Snowflake example, right? You know, it's not having MFA enabled at the front door, and password spraying attacks and info stealer data that's out there on the dark web just being used to spray your application, right, with credentials until they get lucky.
So, Gary, you've opened the door. What are the top challenges you see in security these days?
Getting the basics right. Again, you know, I think we've covered that one, but I think that is an important one. Supply chain we haven't mentioned. I think that's another key one. You know, it's, you know, you've got you know, SBOMs and SALSA and some of these kind of sort of emerging standards, OSCAL, you know, that are starting to kind of help sort of look to try and address that, even through regulation in some cases, around supply chain. I think legacy, like we said before, you know, the fact that for a lot of organizations, it's not just a greenfield move to the cloud. There's a lot of baggage they've got to bring with them, and that probably brings quite a large amount of the risk that goes with it. I think someone touched on it before, but even like the complexity that goes with moving to the cloud, you know, there's a lot of knobs and buttons and things like that you can press in the cloud, right? And that brings its own risk.
There are certainly a lot of knobs in cloud security.
The last one I was going to mention, which probably haven't touched upon, is that we've certainly seen in the last 18 months is sort of CIOs and CFOs maybe challenging the CISO in terms of from a cost perspective. So, you know, it was a brave CIO, CFO that would have challenged, you know, a CISO in years gone by in terms of spending on security because they didn't want to be in the press, right? But actually, in the last 18 months, I think we've started to see that, where kind of CIOs and CFOs are becoming educated enough where they can challenge, and obviously with, you know, the kind of geopolitical situation and cost pressures and everything else, it's kind of added to that. But I think that's quite an interesting one too, the cost challenge.
So, yeah, whole change in cost pressure as well. We haven't really touched upon the data leakage or data security aspect of this. I will not be the first one to trigger the buzzword bingo here, but it's coming at some point. I can feel it. Squigg, top challenges you see in the market now.
Top challenges, just like my
For
call,
security.
the top security challenges are identity, secrets management, people leaking secrets everywhere. And the impact of that is that you haven't done the basics, and thus it comes back and bites you. So, you know, all of us have a very similar top 10 list. We publish a top 10 list of things you should do in AWS. And if you do those things, again, you know, it's not science, but you're 99.999% less likely to have a security incident. The budgetary pressures are real. We are in a frugal cycle at the moment. We watched many of our customers last year, for example, look and see again, how can we reduce our cloud spend? And we help. Big part of how we do business is helping people understand how to spend less money with us. So, you know, we're happy with that. But the investment, on one hand, we need to save money. On the other hand, we need to spend some money and invest in the automation that's going to save us money in the future. And that, for many of our customers, can be difficult. Security professionals are scarce, and we need a more diverse talent pool to pick from. So we don't have many people. We don't have any money to spend, yet we need to be more frugal with what we do and automate. But that's where, for example, we firmly believe that you can be safer on AWS than in your data center because you've got the opportunity to automate things, because you can roll these things into your world. But those basics are a challenge. You know, we unfortunately, some of our customers occasionally have a bad day, and in many of those times when you go and look at these things, you find that it was an MFA on an account. Someone published secrets to GitHub and didn't spot it, that they created admin privileges, so people are not running least privilege, for example. So it's back to that. The challenges are the basics. Do the basics well, and you're going to have a good day.
I think, you know, let's round off on this point because we need to move on. We've talked about a lot about the basics of securing the system. We haven't really talked about securing the behavior or securing the process. Neil, there's a reason why I wanted to come back to you to conclude on this. I'm a big believer in what you say around secure the process, not just the product. That's how security becomes a part of the software development life cycle, how it feeds into SRE, how it feeds into support, how it feeds into disaster recovery protocols. What do you mean by that? It's a really interesting thesis, but we want to hear it from your own words.
So when you think about living in a kind of modern world with the pace with which, you know, the software that you're writing is changing, but also the services that you rely on, platform as a service, software as a service, libraries you incorporate into your product, the pace with which that digital landscape changes is really, really rapid. So unlike if you're as old as me, you remember people going, oh, I'm going to release this piece of software, and 12 months later I'll release another bit, and therefore I'll do a pen test before I release it. That world has gone. We move at a pace that is, you know, blistering compared to that. What's really important is, you know, we talk about run left, we talk about shift left, start left. Everything has to start left. Where those things are, what you do about selecting the software that is part of your product, that's absolutely critical. How do you know that software is secure? How have you tested it? I see on chat we talk about software bill of materials, but also if people are writing code, so whether that's infrastructure as code or as application code, what tools have you given them right in the IDE that they use to write code that is going to tell them that what they've written is secure, is the right thing? And how have you motivated that team? How, you know, there's a phrase that says, you get what you measure. So do you measure that team's ability to produce things that are secure? And so you can feed it back to them. It's really important to put that all the way as quickly as possible in that software delivery chain, because as Greg says, we're always under financial pressure. It is far, far cheaper for a developer to change one line of code at the moment at which they create it than find it has become incorporated into a product far, far further down the software development lifecycle.
So let's Gary, I want to pick your brains on this, right? Security as a thing that developers are now responsible for, DevOps, DevSec, right? Now we're trying to secure the process. It feels like we're pushing a lot onto our colleagues who are writing this, but also at the same time, automation for an SME patching 100,000 VMs or whatever. How fair is it that we're shifting a lot of the responsibility? It's almost like the shared responsibility model is not just between provider and organization. It's now going from saying security is everybody's responsibility, and now therefore nobody's responsibility for it, because it should have been the process, or it should have been the software that was secured. It should have been the components that you bring out in the SBOM. Whose responsibility is it? Or is this just a terrible, terrible point and you don't want to answer it?
No, I think you're right. There is definitely that kind of shifting of responsibility in, in a nirvana. The security team is really just looking after the guardrails, right? And the assurance piece, in an absolute nirvana. Obviously, pretty much every organization is not there, clearly. But I think, and part of that problem is a lot of organizations need to do so much work to do that shift left, to empower those people, those control operators, those people that are actually building the code, now securing the code, responsibility, etc. So I think it's a difficult one, which I don't have an answer to.
All right.
Can I take that? Was it my responsibility in operations when I had to take some diabolical project that had been thrown over the wall with a badly documented set of instructions?
What you're describing is comeuppance now. All right. Look, let's round off. We're a little over on part 2, but this is a very, very important overview. Neil, do you think, this is a very self-serving question because I know the answer is good. I know what the answer is going to be, and that's why people hire us, right? But generally, for the market, do you think that people are ready for the day after? Do you think people are assuming the right mindset? They've talked about the security culture. They're following the basics, like we've all alluded to. Do you think we're ready for the day after? Do you think we do enough for preparedness?
As a general rule, I don't think we do.
Okay.
There's always room for improvement. Every time you do a test, you always learn something. You always find something new. If you then start looking at different scenarios to test, you find new things but the critical thing is you're finding them before somebody finds them for you. And that's absolutely critical. But yes, most organizations have a good journey to go through to get to a point where they are ready for the incident and for incident recovery. But that is a journey we have to start. If you're not already on that journey, please get it started. You do not want to be the next headline.
We'll talk about bug bounties in part 3. It's not just us finding stuff for you. If you have a community that is sufficiently incentivized to tell you that they've hacked you, because it's more valuable, they're going to get some more Starbucks cards. Then that's another way. Joe, are we ready? Are we not ready for the day after?
Generally speaking, there's a balance here, because what I see is that people are really keen to start work, get onto work quickly, deliver product, deliver something, because that's ultimately what they've been measured against. But that is going against the let's sit down, have a calm conversation, let's draw it all out. And it's like the way that we actually get to secure code, secure applications, is by moving slower at the start to make sure that the pieces are in place. But that is exactly opposite the desire of keen teams that are really trying to get things out, get things to market, get experiments tested by the market, and so on and so forth. And so that, I think, is the conflict that you have to manage, and certainly get the prototypes out, but we need to have people coming up quickly behind them to make sure they're architected, to make sure that those everyday basics that we will continue to bang on about are actually in place. And I think that's an operational challenge in the way that you actually manage teams when you're building new things, when you're trying to do something different, because there's always going to be a tension there to slow down but also speed up.
Is Penolver a portmanteau of revolver and penetration testing? I'm going to pass this one over to you. Do you think we're ready for the day after? Do we find that blend between proactive and reactive? Are we still finding it really hard to balance that, do you think, as a sector?
Yeah, I think so. I think and it's a mixture of both, isn't it? I think of making sure you've got the right kind of things in place from a proactive perspective as well as the reactive piece. And I think, as Joe mentioned, it's quite interesting. There's a lot of stats circulating the last few weeks about sort of the problems with agile, which are kind of typified by what Joe was talking about there, and talking about, you know, for that actually one of the really what people should be doing is exactly what Joe said, is sitting down for the big ticket items, for the big requirements, for the big kind of aspects, is actually writing some proper requirements, right? So that you can actually make sure that things are being delivered against those. And that includes security, obviously. So it's quite interesting that I think there's a few things kind of starting to bubble up now where people are starting to realise that the moving fast piece is important, but equally balancing the big ticket items piece and doing it properly versus the small change piece and moving fast with those.
I think it's the gap, it's the size of the gap between the iterations that determines the quality of the product, not how quickly you can actually ship features. That move fast and break things mentality is fine for prototyping, or used to be fine culturally, but now there's a big backlash against move fast and break things, to move fast and don't break things by focusing on the right things. And it's almost, you know, I keep coming back to this idea of, you know, slow is steady and steady is fast when it comes to building security into new software. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to all be slow. You know,
steady.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you build your pipelines properly and you've got the right kind of gates and controls in place, then actually you can move fast. But I think it's about making sure that really you're defining everything that Joe said. Really, I'm not going to repeat it, but just sort of really sort of making sure you understand the requirements and what you're delivering against. I think is quite key.
I will repeat everything that Joe said in the form of a transcript and an on-demand video made available tomorrow. All right, moving on. Taking a proactive stance. This is ironic that we're talking about move fast and don't break it. In part two, it seems to be the perfect segue into this. Neil, move fast and please don't break it. What do we mean by that? Right, we're talking about securing the process. Does it mean locking down the data and say, right, you only get one pipeline, and we're going to be really, really, you know, really strict about the separation of dev, staging, and prod? Or is it a change of principles? What does move fast and don't break it? Why is that now the backlash from DevOps, right? Move fast and don't break it. What does that mean?
So one of the things you've got to do in order to move fast is lean into the automation. So
Good point.
if you have a set of controls that you're trying to implement, make sure they're implemented in an automated way. If you need to know that making a change hasn't broken your application, make sure you actually have automation that tests your application so you know it actually works. So you have confidence to make those changes. Now, whether they're application functionality changes or whether they're security changes, it doesn't matter. Lean into the automation. Use the technology we have. You know, I mean, cloud is absolutely perfect for the ability of, I need to run something, I need it to run now, I need it to do a massive amount of work, and then I need it to disappear until I need it again. It's ideally placed for that type of workload. Use that in terms of the pipelines. So in terms of having those validations done, which allows you to change the product quickly, but have confidence that you haven't broken it. And that's for application code and infrastructure as code.
That's interesting. We often talk about writing policies. We don't actually, we rarely talk about drawing policies. We rarely talk about the sort of blueprints and the visual builders and the infrastructure as code tools that are native to a lot of cloud environments. I'm going to swap part 2 and part 3 around here. And Joe, this is a fantastic bit of thinking about how we prioritize resources and how we prioritize effort. Knowing your threats and knowing the blast radius, the impact of those threats. I've been intellectually captured by what you said during rehearsal here. So run us through it. What does that mean?
So within a within each business, you're going to get specific threats that are going to be targeting you, be it supply chain attacks, be it invoices going to finance through phishing and all those things that we don't normally think about, but come into this idea. And not all of those threats are going to be well understood at the time when you're designing a particular architecture, a particular system. And so one of the things that I was trained from my early career on is to pick a part of the system and say, let's assume this gets compromised. We don't know how it's being compromised, but we have to assume it's being compromised. What happens? And what you find is that if you've designed your system around a fragile outer shell, and there isn't anything securing it or separating things with it internally within the system, then you can have catastrophic issues. In security, we talk about lateral movement, going from one system to the next system to the next system. Really what we need to be thinking about, and we can do this at a very simple level on a whiteboard. If this particular web server is compromised, what happens? And from there, we ultimately can make sure that only a small part of the business, or only a small part of the business or the system or the service that we're building is going to be impacted. And to go to all the previous points about resilience, consistency, and so on and so forth, that's a way of testing what is the impact that we will be facing.
Do you, probably a chat for another time, but think about the largest organ in the human body, our skin. It's designed to keep the bacteria out, but also a very important part of, the system is the immune response, the immune system. What happens once bacteria gets in, or a virus, or any kind of foreign body, anything that sort of destabilizes the system integrity. We have to think about the response that comes from within, the internal controls and procedures. All right. Let's round off on part 3 so we can take some questions at the end. Squigg, knowing that we've talked about building a security culture, we've talked about where some of the threats are coming from, we've talked about the importance of, getting the basics right and the mentality of that. What would be your top recommendations for our audience today? That proactive stance, what would you say that they should take away from this today?
Build security into everything that you do. Do that by agreeing as leaders that security is important. Automate everything. It's okay doing something by hand once. If you have to do the same thing by hand twice, you've failed. Keep humans as far away from data as possible. At AWS and Amazon, the AWS network is effectively air-gapped. The entire thing is our production system, and humans cannot get near it unless there's very exceptional reasons. For example, it's built into the fabric of what we do. And the last thing is blast radius. The reason that data centers get hacked is you got in the data center, to Joe's point, you could do whatever you wanted. There's a nice alignment between security goals and microservices and APIs, which limit the blast radius of things. Everyone is building on cloud now. There is no excuse not to use the inbuilt and inherent security that gives you, where everything can be firewalled, everything can be behind an API, everything can be monitored. Don't pass over the opportunity that you have to do things better, because you cannot move slowly. You're PayPal and you wake up tomorrow and find that PayFriend has just launched. So like Joe's bit slow and steady at the start when you're considering the threat, but moving fast is not optional. You must be able to move fast. How do you create the tools and culture that allows your business to move fast and stay secure at the same time? That's the challenge. It's a challenge for every security professional. You're the business. You're not the defender of the business. You're the business. Your job is to help the business move forward.
It's obvious that these are hard-won lessons and some deep experience. Thank you, Squigg. Gary, top recommendations for our audience to take away today?
Everything we've already said, about doing the basics properly. I think, sort of trying to go full circle on where we started with the culture and governance piece. I think really trying to look at your organization and where it is on that kind of maturity curve, and finding the right path so that you can instill all these things, right? So you can all the things that we've been talking about, and get that kind of right governance to follow suit. As part of that, I think is absolutely key.
Thanks, Gary. Joe?
I would say be lazy. And what I mean by that is make a decision once and then just keep repeating it. If you can outsource your security design decision to an AWS best practice or an existing service, then there have been teams of people working on that. You can use it for what it's intended for. And then when you have this set way of working, this internal best practice approach of this is what this is how we work, this is what we do, then looping back to where we started, tell those stories repeatedly of when you get a new application and a new problem space, you can just take what's off the shelf or what we've learned before and then just reapply it again and again, and just don't keep making the decisions, just make it once, and that's ultimately how you get the speed.
Thank you, Joe. Neil?
For me, engage with the development and the engineering teams and the product ownership, the product management that governs what they do. Across the organization, motivate and measure the delivery of security as part of the product and the service that you provide. Make sure it's driving so that security is the right level and an important thing. It's not focus on features over security, because features won't do you any good if the security fails in a way that means your product and service is no longer trusted. And ultimately test the incident, see how that all behaves, because that is what it's going to tell you whether the other two things are actually working the way you think they are.
I know you've been doing security for 20 plus years, but I absolutely love that in your current role, you're the most security, non-security guy on the team. You've kind of got this global architecture view. Time for questions, right? If it's okay with my panelists, we might keep this open for 5 minutes to go a little bit deeper. Does anybody in the audience have some questions? I'll give you 60 seconds. If you need longer than that, mash the keyboard so I know to keep the call open.
Oh no, we've put everyone to sleep, Frank.
Well, key challenges around visibility, consistency, architecture, keeping things simpler than not. The key takeaways, the things to be thinking about from Stephen, Gary, Joe, and Neil, securing the process, understanding the blast radius. All of this will be available in the write-up. Anybody got any questions for our expert panel?
I think just while you're waiting for the questions, one thing that Neil's is saying is interesting there, and I don't know if you've seen it as well, but we're starting to see people with a job title of Chief Product Security Officer. So something quite new that's starting to see in some spaces, and it's very much focused around exactly what Neil's talking about there, really, about how can it be an enabler, and how can you demonstrate to your customers that you're taking security of your product really seriously, versus as a CISO you have to secure everything, right? It's about securing the organization. So much more sort of outward facing sort of security role. Haven't seen it everywhere, but just seen it sort of pop up in a few places now, which I thought was quite interesting, really, just that kind of demonstrating that importance of what Neil was talking about.
Good. Well, we're at 4 o'clock. Neil Campbell from Cloudsoft, Joe Pindar from Fresh Security, Gary Penolver from Quod Orbis, and Stephen Quigg from AWS. I want to thank you. You guys have been really, really deeply knowledgeable, and thank you very much from the audience as well. I think if there was And we'll round off. The on-demand recording will be available within 48 hours, and we're going to do a little write-up. If you want to take a little screenshot, a little key takeaway, something just to be noodling on your commute home, or if you work in security from your home office, 6 things to think about. At the bottom, you've got a little link for our AWS Cloud Security Review. This is an offering from Cloudsoft. Some of you have indicated in the poll that you wanted to learn about it. Some of you did not. That's fine. We will respect those. But thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule, the audience and the panel.
Thank you, everyone.
Panelists, I'll send you a link and we can debrief just for 5 minutes afterwards. All right. All the best, everybody. Thank you.